Well, hello. There we go. Start over. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to this meeting of the Working Group in Literary and Visual Culture. I'm Jenny Waldo, and I'm a PhD candidate in art history and one of the coordinators for this workshop, along with Laura Webb, also from art history, as well as Rachel Bolton and Catherine Winner, who are both PhD candidates in English. The working group is generously sponsored by a working group research grant from the Stanford Humanities Center, made possible by support from an anonymous donor honoring the work of former SHC Director John Bender, the Mellon Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. So yes, thank you for joining us today for our last event of the winter quarter. And please keep an eye out for an email announcement. The last event of fall quarter, please keep an eye out for our scheduling for the winter quarter. We'll be circulating our schedule in the coming weeks. So to introduce our speaker for today, Grant Bartolome Dowling, is a PhD candidate in the Joint Program for Ancient Philosophy at Stanford University, writing his dissertation on the what to do question in Plato's Socratic dialogues. He has served as the graduate facilitator for the research workshop Ethics and Politics, Ancient and Modern, and has been facilitating Stanford's research workshop in Literature, Philosophy, and the Arts, Phil and Lit, since 2019. In addition to his various projects on ancient philosophy, Grant has presented literary research at conferences, including papers on Thracian stereotypes and Pseudo-Euripides Rhesus at Rutgers University, James Joyce's literary metapsychosis in Ulysses at CUNY, and what classical theories of the afterlife offer classical reception studies at Duke University. Please join me in welcoming Grant.
Excellent. Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to be sharing my screen. That should have the slide visible. So if there's any audio-visual issue, feel free to put it in the chat or let us know, indicate it some other way. And I'd like to thank the audience for coming today. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces and some new faces, and I'd really appreciate your feedback and look forward to it at the end of the talk. So this talk was conceived in Kendall Walton's last aesthetic seminar at Stanford, and he's here today, so that's excellent. I'll be responding to some of Ken's ideas, and I thank him in general for the course and the inspiration for this project. So in that seminar, we looked at Clement Greenberg's aesthetic theory of formalism, and the kind of general motivation for this talk is that there was something to Greenberg's theory or account that I found very appealing, but because it was written in the 1950s and early 1960s for the most part, there's, especially on the philosophy side of the theory, some kind of outdated tools, machinery, perspectives, etc. And on the theory on its own merits might also have a few defects or parts that I find somewhat objectionable. And so this is essentially an analysis of a presentation of a sort of Greenbergian analysis of paintings, and particularly very abstract paintings or pure abstract paintings, which I'll be kind of qualifying and discussing a little bit more. A presentation and then a kind of suggestion for a revision or an update on that kind of formalism in terms of sampling phenomenal concepts, which I'll be kind of introducing to the audience. So hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll have a better grasp of what that means to sample a phenomenal concept. Excellent. Okay, so the outline is first to hopefully briefly introduce aesthetic formalism and what I mean when I talk about abstract paintings and pure abstract paintings. Then I'll turn to Clement Greenberg's particular version of aesthetic formalism, particularly about paintings. And I hope to introduce that relatively quickly. Then I'll introduce three different kinds of problems with Greenberg's view that might motivate an update or a revision to his theory. Then I'll go ahead and kind of propose my own update or revision. And I'll do that in terms of a kind of representation or aboutness that these very abstract or pure abstract paintings have. And I'll put that in terms of illocutionary force, which is which I'll be explaining a little bit and is associated with pragmatics in philosophy. That is a semantic theory, an idea about what meaning is. And another kind of less pragmatic semantic theory, but another semantic theory that would kind of couch this sort of representation as a cognitive effect rather than as maybe something like illocutionary force. Particularly, I'll say that what this non-imagistic paintings illocutionary force is, or what cognitive effect they are apt to produce, is something like sampling phenomenal concepts. So that's kind of my original contribution, is first tying the idea of phenomenal concepts to this mental act of sampling, and then proposing that this is what non-imagistic works, very abstract modern paintings, are apt to produce in a kind of special way. And then I'll end with two kind of objections to this view and reasons for hesitancy for kind of completely adopting this view of how to look at paintings. All right, so now for my brief overview of formalism. Formalism is a movement in aesthetics and art criticism that began in the 19th century and generated theories which evaluate works of art according to how well they instantiate the essential characteristics of their medium. So one of the very earliest formalists, for instance, in this kind of tradition is Edward Hanslick. He's all the way to the left there, from Germany. And he wrote in On the Musically Beautiful that music should not represent feelings. So here, representation comes up as something crucial for the formalists and something that they're trying to restrict for certain sorts of media and certain kinds of art. So Hanslick says that music as a medium should not represent feelings, but rather only tonal forms. And the result of that would be that this is a quote, the fanciful portrayals, characterizations, and circumspections of a musical work are either figurative or perverse. And so looking for fanciful representations, characterizations in terms of anthropomorphism and that sort of thing, or connections between music and vistas or imagined scenarios, circumspections, all those sort of things are figurative and perverse, according to the formalist point of view, as Hanslick was introducing it in the 1850s. So this got picked up and adopted by art critics who were less concerned with music, like Edward Hanslick, but who were more interested in painting. And so two of these critics include Clive Bell and Roger Fry, who are in with the Bloomsbury Group in the UK. And they were arguing that just as Hanslick said, music shouldn't be used to envision or represent fanciful portrayals, characterizations, and circumspections. In a similar way, art, our visual art and painting should not be evaluated by its depictive content, but rather just by the formal elements of the work. But Fry, for instance, who's all the way on the right, recognized that in fact, formalism was an intervention on the way that the population was interacting with visual art. And so this was a cutting edge theory that aimed at intervention on how audiences were perceiving paintings. So Fry goes on to say that the greater number of people are accustomed to rely almost exclusively on their interest in or emotions about the persons, events called to mind by the imagery of the fine arts. Landscapes, for such, is just reminiscence or revelation of pleasant natural scenes. So what audience who isn't sophisticated, isn't looking at works according to the formalist program, sees in the landscape are the memories and emotional reactions they have to the depicted features of the landscape. Similarly, portraiture by the beautiful or fascinating ladies and celebrated gentlemen it presents. And also, figure painting avails by its attractive or provocative nudes. So again, it's the depicted content that Fry thought was getting the bulk of the attention of the art-going public. But in fact, when viewing paintings, these formalists were trying to shift attention to the formal qualities of these works of art, especially for our aesthetic experiences and our aesthetic evaluations of the work. And so broadly, this kind of non-formalist way of looking at paintings, formalists started dubbing literary. And that was how they contrasted their own program with other ways of looking at works of art that are more engaged with the depicted content in those works. So what literary absorption would entail is that viewers are drawn away from the formal elements of a work where its true aesthetic value can be experienced, but instead they get caught up with other features of the paintings. So according to R.K. Elliott, for instance, the percipient's mode of perception may be transformed as if he were in the very room, looking at a real woman standing before him in a mirror, not with the neutral attitude of someone looking at something in a picture, but with an affectionate or even loving glance. He is no longer aware of the exaggerated color or the decorative aspect of the picture. So there's this kind of absorption in a scene as if you're getting absorbed into a literary passage with characters and mise en scène and that sort of thing. And so these formalists claim that literary absorption in a painting's content draws its viewers away from its formal elements where that aesthetic value is. So here's an example from Roger Fry. Here's this Bruegel painting, The Procession to the Cavalry. I love Bruegel, and so it's somewhat humorous to read Fry's appraisal of it all these years later. He writes, "We recognize at once that this is a great psychological invention, the painting is, setting up profound vibrations of feeling within us by its poignant condensation of expression. But here's the kind of formalist evaluation. But it is, I repeat, purely literary. And throughout this picture, it is clear that Bruegel has subordinated plastic to psychological considerations. It is indeed, to my mind, entirely trivial and inexpressive when judged as a plastic and spatial creation, more closely akin in its essence to literature than it is to plastic art." So that's to illustrate the way that formalists were applying this idea of the literary absorption of an audience and even the sort of literary tools and mode of expression in a painter that they would judge to be deficient or bad or make a painting less valuable or something like that. But these formalists, formalists writing about painting, Clive Bell and Roger Fry, were developing their theories at a time where painting was becoming more and more abstract and modernist techniques were focusing on features of paintings beyond just depicted content. And so there's this commonly cited painting by Vasily Kandinsky from 1913 that's taken to be the first non-depictive easel painting in the Western tradition. That's debated. At least Hilma Afklint, for instance, has paintings without obvious depicted content. Of course, she wasn't sharing those publicly at the time, but those would have predated Kandinsky, and it's likely there's other candidates out there for the first non-imagistic painting, even in the Western tradition. But I just threw up another example there of Ernst Ney in 1952. So these formalists who were pushing for evaluating paintings and experiencing them through non-literary means in any way that can attend just to the formal features without literary absorption into the content, were broadly excited and positive about this development of more and more abstraction in paintings. So now I'm going to introduce some conceptual tools for what abstraction is. So the way I'm considering or thinking about abstraction is restrictions or limitations on aboutness. And so with this kind of notion or definition of what abstraction is, you can come pretty trivially to the conclusion that all art is abstract because all art in some respect constrains its relationships of aboutness. There's no kind of Gesamtkunstwerk that's about everything in every respect. Usually just by choosing a certain kind of medium, one is sacrificing sense modalities or expressive means, and therefore creating a artifact that will be abstract in at least some respect. While all art is abstract insofar as it is constraining relationships of aboutness in some way just by appearing in a certain medium, let's say, these paintings that I was just showing, starting, let's say, with Kandinsky in the early 1910s and then going onward in modern painting, aspired to be something like pure abstract art, to kind of get rid of all sorts of aboutness relationships, to really be about nothing but the to be about nothing, just to be a certain set of colors and formal features. And so something that I'll be asking in this talk, and that's kind of one of my focalizing questions, is does pure or very abstract art, that is especially paintings that have constrained as many relationships of aboutness as we can imagine, do those sorts of paintings have distinctive aesthetic experiences? Can those experiences be characterized propositionally? And is there some leftover residue of aboutness or representation in these paintings, so that they're not pure abstract, they still are about or represent something? And in some of Ken's recent work, he's sketched at least one route for finding aboutness in these very abstract paintings, and that's in terms of the representation of a real or he focuses on imagined act of creation. And so I'll read out Ken's quote. An assortment of examples will demonstrate the importance of how works appear to have come about. To begin with, the blatantly obvious, the abstract expressionist works that can get described as action paintings or gestural paintings. And for an instance of one of those, there's Ladybug by Joan Mitchell. That's an example of one of these action or gestural paintings. So this is a really obvious example for Ken, because knowing what actions Joan Mitchell took in Ladybug, the painting I just flashed, knowing what action she performed in creating her paintings wouldn't be enough. We want to see in the picture how she worked. Joan Mitchell's manipulations of paintbrushes and Jackson Pollock's dripping and splashing are obvious and are meant to be obvious. The artist no doubt intended viewers to notice these appearances and probably to imagine the activities that are apparent in their works. Perhaps there is a general understanding in the case of action or gestural paintings like these that what appears to be the case is to be imagined. If so, I wouldn't mind saying that these paintings represent actions by which they were created, that they represent what appears to be the case. So it may be because of or by virtue of appearing to have been splattered that it counts as representing the splattering. This representation is not a depiction. We don't see the artist working. So here's a Joan Mitchell gestural or action painting. It's titled Ladybug, and there's little splashes of red. And so it's an open question about whether there's depiction in this painting at all. And it seems like a plausible interpretation to say you can kind of see the ladybug flying around by looking at these little splotches of red, or imagine different ladybugs or something like that. But the formalists would urge us not to go looking for that sort of depictive content when we're experiencing the painting and judging its value. The next question then would be, is there anything that this painting is about or represents? And Ken gives us one option for looking for that representation. It's what the painting appears to have been created by. It appears to have been generated by certain sorts of techniques. And therefore, we can say that the painting isn't about nothing, but that it actually represents that apparent mode of creation, something like that. So I won't be focusing on this particular kind of aboutness or representation for my presentation about these pure abstract works. I'll be thinking about the way that they might be about or represent our phenomenal concepts of the works themselves. But I just wanted to give some conceptual background to what I mean by abstraction when I'm talking about pure abstract works. All works are abstract in some respects. Abstract modern paintings particularly try to reduce these relationships of aboutness. And the way they do that is by getting rid or obscuring their depicted content. But nonetheless, there still might be other ways that these paintings represent or are about. And Ken has suggested one that they could be about their apparent creation, the apparent techniques that went into their generation. And you can kind of look into the Joan Mitchell painting and imagine how it was created. And so that might be one way that the painting is representing something. Okay, so that's my introduction to formalism and abstraction. Now I'm going to turn to Clement Greenberg's theory in particular. So Clement Greenberg is one of those formalists who welcomes this intervention in modern painting of restricting depicted content. In his account of how this trend in modern painting came to be, he writes, the arts could only save themselves by demonstrating that the kind of experience they provided was valuable in its own right and not to be obtained from any other kind of activity. So these formalists oftentimes are trying to find some distinctive feature for different medium for what makes for a successful work of art within that medium and what is the right sort of way to experience and value that medium. So in painting in particular, Greenberg goes on to say that whereas one tends to see what is in an old master before seeing it as a picture, one sees a modernist painting that's reducing its kinds of aboutness, particularly with respect to depiction. One sees a modernist painting as a picture first before seeing into it. This is, of course, the best way of seeing any kind of picture, old master or modernist, but modernism imposes it as the only and necessary way. Visual art should confine itself exclusively to what is given in visual experience and make no reference to anything given in other orders of experience. Modernist painting asks that a literary theme be translated into strictly optical, two-dimensional terms. So this movement from literary themes in painting to more strictly optical, two-dimensional approaches that painters are taking is something that Greenberg welcomes. And the objective difference between an old master and modernist reduces itself to the subjective tendencies in the viewer. This is, Leo Steinberg's description of Greenberg's theory. So according to Leo Steinberg, what this entails is that there's going to be a difference in the viewer for Greenberg when someone looks at an old master painting versus a more abstract or pure abstract modernist painting. It is the viewer who is looking into an old master painting and tends to see the illusion before seeing the picture. So I'll come back to Steinberg at the end of my talk for an objection to the view that I'm proposing, but he makes it clear that these paintings are kind of apt to produce different sorts of experiences, and Greenberg thinks that the more appropriate experience for a painting is those that don't generate that kind of literary absorption. And so here's an example of an all-over painting, the sorts of paintings that Greenberg is contrasting with these old master paintings. So on the one hand, the old masters with these easel paintings, they subordinate decorative to dramatic effect. And we saw Roger Fry criticizing Bruegel for that. And they also cut an illusion of a box-like cavity and organize the three-dimensional semblances in this cavity into a unity. And so you can see this effect pretty clearly in old master still lifes. Here's one by Clara Peters, still life with cheeses, almonds, and pretzels. And you can see how a box-like cavity is kind of cut into the wall or picture plane, where you can kind of see into the painting as if it has depth and as if it's three-dimensional. On the other hand, these all-over paintings, like this one by Janet Sobel from 1946, emphasizes flatness and frontality, according to Greenberg. They abandon representation of recognizable three-dimensional space. They're evenly and tightly textured rectangle of paint. They lack explicit oppositions. They're polyphonic. They dispense with a beginning, middle, and end. And importantly, every element and area of the picture is roughly equivalent in accent and emphasis. And so here's another all-over painting by Lee Krasner. You can see it's there's no real beginning, middle, or end to it. There's no part of the canvas that seems more kind of emphasized than another one. And so this kind of exemplifies what Greenberg saw as valuable in all over paintings and the experiences that they were apt to produce. And so I'll just kind of wrap up now about these experiences that Greenberg thought were so valuable and kind of grounds the value of modernist painting. So Greenberg writes, but ideally the whole of a picture should be taken in at a glance. Its unity should be immediately evident. It's all there at once, like a sudden revelation. This at-onceness in abstract picture usually drives home to us with greater singleness and clarity than a representational painting does. And to apprehend this at-onceness demands the freedom of mind and untrammeledness of eye that constitute at-onceness in their own right. Those who have grown capable of experiencing this know what I mean. You are summoned and gathered into one point in the continuum of duration. The picture does this to you willy-nilly, regardless of whatever else is on your mind. A mere glance at it creates the attitude required for its appreciation, like a stimulus that elicits an automatic response. And so according to Greenberg, this at-once effect is supposed to be generated by the Lee Krasner all over painting, or the Janet Sobel, whereas in the Clara Peters still life, you take in different parts of the painting one at a time. Your eye travels to look at different entities and then thinks about the relationship between those different parts of the painting rather than forming kind of one all over concept of it all at once. And the depicted content encourages or is apt to produce that effect in a viewer. So getting rid of the depicted content also makes the painting less apt to produce that kind of literary absorption and rather allow a viewer to take in the at-onceness of the painting. Okay, so there's a Pollock too that you are supposed to take in at once as opposed to the still life. All right, my last quotes from Greenberg here further illustrate this kind of experience he's talking about. This at-onceness that you'll see in a painting. So Greenberg writes, this pinpointing of the attention, this complete liberation and concentration of it offers what is largely a new experience to most people in our sort of society. And it is, I think, a hunger for this particular kind of experience that helps account for the growing popularity of abstract art in this country, for the way it is taking over in the art schools, the galleries, and the museums. So there's something about this at-onceness that Greenberg thinks is really valuable and unique and hard to access through other forms or activities in society. He goes on, contemplativeness is demanded in greater or lesser degree for the appreciation of every kind of art, but abstract art, and by abstract, again, he means this very abstract art, and particularly abstracting from depicted representations, tends to present this requirement in quintessential form, at its purest, least diluted, most immediate. If abstract art, as does happen nowadays, should chance to be the first kind of pictorial art we learn to appreciate, the chances are that when we go to see other kinds of pictorial art, the old masters say, and I hope we all do go to the old masters eventually, we shall find ourselves all the better able to enjoy them. So Greenberg thinks that there is some aesthetic value that these old masters have, unlike Roger Fry, who just kind of categorically thinks Bruegel paintings, for instance, are just literary in their expression and offer nothing in terms of the kind of plastic expression. Greenberg is more optimistic that the formal elements of old master paintings really do have some distinctively valuable elements to appreciate and value, but he thinks that oftentimes literary absorption in the content gets in the way. So by developing the skill of taking in the at-onceness of paintings and developing the contemplativeness that that sort of aesthetic attention and experience demands, then you can kind of go back to old master paintings and look at them as if they were all over paintings, where you're not paying attention to the specific depicted content, but in fact, you are actually looking at just the formal features and having the sort of experience that isn't literary, that Greenberg thinks is what we should be striving for when it comes to the experience of paintings. And just to put to wrap up Greenberg's view, he writes, how many people I know who have hung abstract pictures on their wall and found themselves gazing at them endlessly and then exclaiming, I don't know what there is in it in that painting, but I can't take my eyes off it. This kind of bewilderment is salutary. It does us good not to be able to explain either to ourselves or to others what we enjoy or love. It expands our capacity for experience. And so this contemplativeness that Greenberg brings out as that salutary effect of abstract paintings has a tradition that goes all the way back to Kant, and particularly the disinterestedness that Kant thinks is characteristic of aesthetic experience. So now I'll turn to some criticisms of Greenberg's account that motivate why it's worthwhile for me to kind of update Greenberg and bring him into the 20th century, furnishing his view with 21st century philosophical tools like phenomenal concepts and sampling. So the first major kind of problem with Greenberg's formalism is that it's just very rooted in Kant, and there's now alternatives in aesthetic philosophy. We might not want to be Kantians anymore. So if you look at the right side of the slide, first from Benson-Nenet's introduction, very short introduction to aesthetics, he kind of quickly introduces Kant's theory of aesthetics, but says for the 21st century, for the book he's writing, the very short introduction of aesthetics, a for its own sake account captures important aspects of aesthetic experiences, but it's not the only important aspect. So it seems to be the kind of consensus 101 view that Kant created a valuable contribution to aesthetics, but it doesn't kind of exhaust what aesthetic features are or what an account of aesthetic value would need to account for. So that's just a kind of contemporary aesthetician introducing the discipline of aesthetics in his very short introduction and pointing out that today, just having a Kantian approach to aesthetics isn't taken to be sufficient, that other sorts of approaches are needed in tandem. Also, it seems there's been a controversy or a kind of protracted theoretical battle on the one side between 21st century formalists, the new formalists, as Majory Levinson calls them, and historicists on the other hand. And so part of what's motivating this controversy between the new formalists and the historicists are that those who campaign to bring back a sharp demarcation between history and art, discourse and literature with form, so that's why they're called new formalists, regarded as the condition of aesthetic experience as traced to Kant, i.e. disinterested, autotelic, playful, pleasurable, consensus generating, and therefore both individually liberating and conducive to effective social cohesion, the prerogative of art. And so being a formalist in the Greenbergian way that roots the value of aesthetic features in disinterested contemplation, that feature of experience. On the one hand, aestheticians today might think that it's a little bit too narrow, that there's aesthetic experiences and features beyond just for its own sake type experiences of works. And on the other hand, it kind of embroils you in a controversy with historicists, which is not something I don't have any bones to pick with historicism. And so maybe kind of relaxing the Kantian formalism is one reason why we'd want to update Greenberg's account. Another reason why we might want to update and furnish Greenberg's account with different sorts of conceptual resources than Kantianism to explain the value of formal works is that Greenberg's Kantianism is somewhat confused. And so there's two passages here. I guess to save on time, I won't go into them. But on the one hand, Crowther in 1985 points out that Greenberg's conception of aesthetic experience is overly intellectualist. And on the other hand, Costello, in a more recent article from 2007, points out a few different conflations or contradictions in Greenberg's application of Kant's philosophy to aesthetics. And so hardcore Kantians probably aren't even happy with the way that Greenberg is applying some of these Kantian theories to formalism. Even if they are Kantians about aesthetics, Greenberg's application seems to be wanting. And so if we provide an alternative, that might be desirable. And lastly, there's this fantastic quote from Tom Wolfe. Greenberg is trying to show that these paintings need to be experienced and valued in terms of their formal features alone. And literary, as you remember, is the problem with older kinds of paintings, and especially the way that they were being experienced by audiences. But Tom Wolfe, in his book, The Painted Word, shows that these pure abstract works might be considered just as literary in a certain sort of sense as the literary absorption that Roger Fry was pointing out in the example of the Bruegel painting, where you get caught up in the narrative aspects of the painting, and the painter himself is subordinating formal features to get more expression and better depiction of the content. And so Wolf replies that, in fact, Greenberg's account opens up these modern paintings to a certain sort of literary interpretation themselves. And I'll read this out because it's so rhetorically enjoyable. He writes, let me take a sip. All these years, along with countless kindred souls, I am certain I had made my way into the galleries of Upper Madison and Lower Soho, and the Art Guildo midway of 57th Street, and into the museums, into the Modern, the Whitney and the Guggenheim, the Bastard Bauhaus, the New Brutalist, the Fountainhead Baroque, into the lowliest storefront churches and the grandest Robert baronial temples of modernism. All these years, I, like so many others, had stood in front of 1,000, 2,000, God knows how many thousands, Pollocks, de Koonings, Newmans, Nolans, Rothkos, Rauschenbergs, Judds, Joneses, Johnses, Olitskis, Louises, Stills, Franz Kleins, Frankenthalers, Kellys, Frank Stellas. Now squinting, now popping the eye sockets open, now drawing back, now moving closer, waiting, forever waiting for it to come into focus, namely the visual reward for so much effort, which must be there, which everyone, tout le monde, especially Clement Greenberg, knew or espoused to be there, waiting for something to radiate directly from the paintings on these invariably pure white walls in this room, in this moment, into my own optic chiasma. All these years, in short, I had assumed that in art, if nowhere else, seeing is believing. And that seems like something on board with the formalists, to be looking for the formal features rather than bringing in other non-painterly memories, emotions, etc., and carrying those into the experience of the work. But he says, well, how very short-sighted. Now at last, on April 28th, 1974, I could see. I had gotten it backwards all along. Not seeing is believing, Unini, but believing is seeing. For modern art has become completely literary. The paintings and other works exist only to illustrate the text. And the text Wolf here is talking about are the art critics, particularly the formalists, who are developing a advanced theory of how to look at these paintings. According to Wolf, the paintings themselves aren't producing these effects, and for years and years going to see them, you'll never have this sort of epiphany unless you're reading Greenberg's theory or other sorts of formalists and bringing those in addition to what's ever on the canvas when you experience them. And only by kind of looking through these art critical theories does one have the sort of experiences that Greenberg recommends. And so, in fact, even as the formalists like Fry and Clive Bell and later Clement Greenberg are railing against literary absorption in the depicted content of the paintings, Wolf is pointing out that his theory actually requires a whole kind of outside set of ideas for the viewer to kind of bring in and see with. And that might be another strong objection to Greenberg's approach. All right, so now I'm going to introduce my update or my proposed revision to Greenberg's theory. So first of all, and this again, thanks to Ken and his seminar for disambiguating these kinds of aboutness, representation of depicted content is just one kind of representation. There's lots of other kinds of representation that can go on in a work of art as well. So besides just the fictional worlds that are depicted, a work can seem to embody a persona or to have been created by a persona that it represents. A painting or any kind of work of art might have a message, and that could be what the work is about or represents. There might also be some non-representational expression akin to a musical persona that's only like a quasi-musical persona or something like that. And this relates to some research in aesthetics by Peter Kivy, this distinction. There's also what I quoted from Ken earlier in this talk, the idea of how the work came to be about. It can be the actual physical causal origin of a painting. A painting can kind of be about its origin, or as the quotation from Ken, that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the intention, or I'm sorry, the intention of its artist, or the one that I mentioned at the beginning, how it appears to have been produced. These are all kind of ways of representation, but I'm going to be proposing this fifth kind, what I'm calling pragmatic aboutness. And two examples of other theorists who have worked with this kind of aboutness for art. Rebecca West has argued that architecture expresses opinions about what activities will go on within and around it. And Daisy Dixon, in a recent dissertation, argued that art can perform actions, including speech acts, through illocutionary force. And so that'll be the kind of general aboutness or representation that I'm inspired by Greenberg to find in these kind of pure or very abstract paintings. And so in that dissertation, Dixon writes that, so I use this word illocutionary force, that traces back to J.L. Austin's speech act theory. And basically the locutionary force, or the locution of a sentence, is what it literally says. It's the dictionary definitions of its meaning, and how in its most kind of deflationary sense what the sentence means in a language. But a sentence can perform all kinds of other functions, as Austin points out. For example, if you say "I do" at a wedding ceremony, that is a performative act. It has the force of wedding two different people. And language can have all kinds of force in addition, or perform actions in addition to what's kind of literally being expressed by the language. And so that's what illocutionary force is. And Dixon's dissertation, as she says, presents a workable explanation of illocutions by illocutionary force in art. She explores how it can be used to argue that artworks can perform illocutions. She writes, it's also important to note that Dixon neither claims that art can perform all illocutions, nor that all artworks can perform illocutions. And this is what I think also offers some helpful motivation for my project. She writes, equally, it's unclear what acts might be performed by more abstract works, such as Rothko's color field paintings or Mondrian's geometric paintings. She writes, I don't want to rule out such examples, but I make the weaker claim that some artworks can perform illocutions, namely depictive artworks are the ones that she focuses on in her 2018 dissertation. And so that was just 3 years ago. It seems like there's still room in the literature and in aesthetic research to come in and fill in what sorts of illocutionary acts are performed by more abstract works. So that's essentially what I'm trying to propose in this talk. Donald Davidson offers a non-pragmatic semantic theory in the 1970s. And I think it's especially clear with respect to his research on metaphor. So Donald Davidson makes a distinction between a sentence's meaning and its cognitive effect. And he thinks, and this might be able to provide a more neutral semantic framework where this aboutness wouldn't be necessarily pragmatic. And so if there's some issue with me calling this aboutness pragmatic, maybe adopting a Davidsonian semantics would be more effective. So for Davidson, a sentence's meaning is the literal definitions of its constituents. Everything else beside the sentence's literal meaning, he calls its cognitive effect. For example, in his paper, What Metaphors Mean, Davidson argues that there are no special metaphorical meanings of sentences which contain metaphors. Instead, Davidson maintains that metaphors mean what the words in their most literal interpretation mean. So metaphors are trivially true, or for the most part, literally false. The other effect of a metaphor, whatever kind of click it does and allows you to see, that gets grouped under cognitive effect rather than meaning. And while Davidson's topic in What Metaphors Mean is linguistic metaphor, many theorists, such as Charles Forceville, has extended the semantics of metaphor to non-linguistic modalities. He writes, in representations with a multimodal metaphor, one can, for instance, present conditions with and without music, written text, spoken text, and or a visual context. So just as Davidson views a sentence without any literal meaning as like a nonsense type sentence, let's say, or something with a string of characters with spaces that don't have any words, a sentence like that would have no meaning, according to Davidson. The only thing left over, if it doesn't have meaning, is cognitive effect. And so if we extend that distinction to paintings, the meaning of a painting would be what it's literally depicting. And everything else the painting does, according to Davidson's semantic theory, would fall under cognitive effect. And so when we get rid of literal depiction completely in some of these all over paintings, then all we're left with is cognitive effect. And so what I'm trying to trace or get at can be viewed from the pragmatic perspective, maybe as the illocutionary force of these paintings, or from the Davidsonian semantics, this would maybe fall under cognitive effect or something like that. Okay, so now for my proposal in terms of phenomenal concepts. So phenomenal concepts became a focus of philosophy. They were kind of introduced a little bit in the late 1970s, but especially flowered in the 80s and 90s. And they essentially developed in response to functionalist accounts of mind. So it became very popular in the 1980s to view mind as a state of inputs, outputs, and functional states realizable in different sorts of materials, such as silicon chips, let's say. And so these functionalist accounts of mind were very popular with physicalists who didn't want to deny some kind of dualism where there's some metaphysical domain that the mind takes up, but nonetheless, they wanted some psychology. They didn't want to completely eliminate talks about mental states and that sort of thing. And so these functionalist accounts became quite popular. But one of the problems for these functional accounts was whether the experiential features of mental states could be captured by these frameworks or not, because the experience of what it's like to hold a mental state that's a functional state, or the input or output of these functional states, it didn't seem like there was a role for that what it's like feature of mental experience in the functionalist theories. And so this what it's like that I've been describing, one word for it is qualia, another is phenomenal experience. So when I say phenomenal concepts, what I mean is concepts about what it's like, concepts about qualia. You can also think of the first person perspective, going back to Nagel's what is it like to be a bat? If you think about what it's like from the first person perspective to be in a certain situation, frequently what you're trying to isolate or emphasize is the qualia, the phenomenal experience, the experiential features of the mental states of that perspective. So then I'll give a kind of slightly more rigorous account of what these phenomenal concepts are briefly from Michael Tye and Brian Lohr. So for Michael Tye, a concept is phenomenal if and only if it is laid down in memory as a result of going appropriate experiences. So again, these mental experiential features are crucial. It tends to trigger appropriate conscious images or quasi-images. You'll see that he thinks pain, for instance, can count under this rubric. And so it's these quasi-images don't really need to be visual in response to certain cognitive tasks. And 3, it enables its possessors to discriminate the phenomenal quality to which it refers directly and immediately via introspection. So Brian Lohr further explains what a phenomenal concept is. On a natural view of ourselves, we introspectively discriminate our own experiences and thereby form conceptions of their qualities, both salient and subtle. These discriminations of various degrees of generality, from small differences in tactual and color experience to broad differences of sensory modality, for example, those among smell, hearing, and pain. What we apparently discern are ways experiences differ and resemble each other with respect to what it is like to have them. So you form a concept of what it's like to have these certain experiences. Following common usage, I will call these experiential resemblances phenomenal qualities, and the conceptions we have of them phenomenal concepts. So phenomenal concepts are formed from one's own case. They are type demonstratives that derive their reference from first person perspective, from that type of sensation. And Lohr considers these recognitional concepts, which will be important for my point about sampling. Lastly, going back to Tye, these phenomenal concepts are paradigmatically have the form that phenomenal property. So the that in that phenomenal property, which we see in all caps, is the indexical or demonstrative that, which refers to the phenomenal property exemplified in an associated mental sample. presumably an image or quasi-image. And if you go down to the star, you can see that he wants to include pain as within what these quasi-images are. Phenomenal concepts have the structure of that phenomenal quality, where the indexical refers to the phenomenal quality exemplified in associated mental sample. So Ty then connects the development and what it is to have a phenomenal quality with some indexical, and the indexical, the that, when you have a phenomenal property, is exemplified in an associated mental sample. So my solution that I'm proposing, or my update to Greenberg's formalism that I'm proposing, is that rather than being apt to produce disinterested contemplation, as Greenberg proposes, this mental sampling is what I want to point as, using this language from and concepts from the philosophy of mind as a kind of updated formalism, or an updated view of what Greenberg is proposing. Okay, so he talks about an associated mental sample, but that might not be 100% clear what a sample is. We can turn to Wittgenstein in the Blue Book from the 1930s, who kind of writes about sampling and what it would be to sample. He writes, "Our ordinary language has no means for describing a particular shade of color, such as the brown of my table or the magenta on one of these swatches which you pick out. Thus, it is incapable of producing a picture of this color. If I want to tell someone what material it is to be, I am to send him a sample. And obviously, this sample belongs to language, and equally a memory or image of a color that I conjure by a word belongs to a language." So this is starting to develop the idea of what it would be to sample a color. Some things that we're unable to put words on otherwise, we can communicate in terms of samples. He goes on, "There is one way of avoiding at least partly occult appearances of the processes of thinking, and it is to replace in these processes any working of the imagination by acts of looking at real objects." So this is Wittgenstein kind of with a deflationary account of what thinking is, or at least he's putting thinking in terms of sampling. He says, "Thus, it may seem essential that, at least in certain cases, when I hear the word red with understanding, a red image should be before my mind's eye. But why should I not substitute seeing a red bit of paper for imagining a red patch? The visual image will only be the more vivid. Imagine a man always carrying a sheet of paper in his pocket on which the names of colors are coordinated colored patches. You may say that it would be a nuisance to carry such a table of samples about with you, and that the mechanism of association is what we always use instead of it. But this is irrelevant, and in many cases, it is not even true. If, for instance, you were ordered to paint a particular shade of blue called Prussian blue, you might have to use the table to lead you from the word Prussian blue to a sample of the color, like the samples we're looking at, which would serve as your copy. We could perfectly well, for our purposes, replace every process of imagining by a process of looking at an object, or by painting, drawing, or modeling." So this is just to kind of illustrate philosophically what sampling is and how it's akin to thinking. When you're trying to describe a certain car, let's say, you might not have the exact name for what the car is, but you might indicate it through this kind of recognitional concept that it was something like that. And so you could indicate one of the cars, and it's not exactly clear what your which features of the car you're picking out with the demonstrative, maybe until you single them out or use more examples, and the different sorts of examples that you're sampling with a demonstrative like that would have some kind of feature in common. We don't have much time, but this song is, I have a link here that will take just 20 seconds.
Hi, I'm Nicole Hockley from Sandy Hook Promise.
This is from the Monty Python play Spamalot.
Once in every show, there comes a song like this. It starts off soft and low and ends up with a kiss. Oh, where here's the song that goes like this. Where is it? Where? Sentimental
All right. So the point of that Spamalot song, which I think is mocking Stephen Sondheim, RIP, is that the song goes like this. And so the song demonstratively refers to itself as a sample of the sort of song in general, the recognitional phenomenal concept we'd have of that sort of song. And so you can sample color patches, you can sample concrete examples. Something can even sample itself to illustrate a recognitional phenomenal concept. And what I'm proposing is, rather than Greenberg's view that by getting rid of representational content, all over paintings generate disinterested contemplation in their viewers, and that's why the paintings are distinctively valuable, with this language of phenomenal concepts that I've introduced, and now sampling and the idea of sampling a phenomenal concept. That's the kind of alternative that I'm proposing from this formalist perspective for what sort of effect these modern, very abstract paintings have, and what might be valuable or distinctive about the experience of viewing them. So if you sample a phenomenal concept, you can use the demonstrative this or some other predicate to characterize an intentional attitude. So when you say the this, it can refer to some kind of mental state or attitude. So the this samples one's own mental state, indicating a kind or property that the particular mental state saliently possesses. The demonstrative functions like a predicate, and it's a common form for beliefs. Of course, this, like it was a car like that, another demonstrative, is highly ambiguous. And so it's been, there's been a lot of philosophical work on how we go about fixing the references for these phenomenal concepts. But nonetheless, sampling one's own mental state secures a special understanding, access, and way of thinking about a property, not necessarily secured by linguistic predicates. You can say the song goes like this, and that's highly ambiguous until you call to mind a sample of the song. If you think about how it goes, and then you'd have that special understanding, access, and way of thinking about the property of the song like this. What is that kind of property? You won't be able to understand it, access it, or have a way of thinking about it unless you're sampling it to yourself. So in Ken Walton's essay In Other Shoes, he developed the idea of sampling phenomenal concepts for empathy. To sample what it's like for other people to be in a situation is what it means to empathize with them, to envision what mental state they were going through, and then to kind of play it in your own head to feel what it's like. And so these phenomenal concepts can be employed when we learn about others imaginatively, by imagining being in their shoes and attending to the content of our own judgment about what it's like to be in that situation that person's in. And so we access our own psychological states by means of introspection in some first-person privileged manner, and this judgment employs an intentional attitude. And the image that was distributed with my talk, this Norman Rockwell painting called The Connoisseur, it's interesting, first of all, because it has formal features like these all over paintings, particularly in the middle upper part of the canvas, but it contains depiction. It's depicting an all over abstract painting rather than actually being one. And it's also depicting a human being in the foreground looking at the all over abstract painting. And I think one thing that a viewer is kind of encouraged to do in this painting is imagine what it's like for the connoisseur to be viewing this abstract painting, that the connoisseur is getting some distinctive value from looking at the painting. Clement Greenberg would want to put that value in terms of disinterested contemplation. My proposal is that we don't need to use that kind of loaded Kantian framework, but nonetheless, there is something that it's like to view these works of art. Norman Rockwell stages it through depiction very well, so that we're encouraged in this literary absorption kind of way to imagine what it's like for this character that's depicted to be looking at this work of art. And my general proposal is that all over abstract paintings encourage us to sample what it's like to look at the painting, even without this added depictive element of an audience member in them, that what the paintings are about beyond just how they appear to have been made is somehow they're about what it's like to view them or what it's like to experience them. And so when we look at this painting by Joe from 1962, for example, there's some kind of feeling, some kind of attendant phenomenal experience of what it's like to look at these paintings. And I argue that all over paintings and kind of pure abstract paintings like this are more apt to produce reflection on what it's like to view them than more depictive sort of paintings, which are liable to produce this literary absorption that Clive Bell and Roger Fry and the other sorts of formalists, including Greenberg, were railing against. Phenomenal concepts are helpful for describing experiences, as Wittgenstein was pointing out, where we don't have much vocabulary or concrete content to put words to. And so I think it's especially effective for these all over paintings where a viewer might feel unmoored and lacking some kind of specific grounded set of vocabulary or set of features to describe the kind of generality of the demonstrative of the recognitional concepts, which are phenomenal concepts. The like this part of them makes, I think, phenomenal concepts particularly apt to experience and conceptualize very abstract paintings. And I've been thinking about this kind of aboutness in terms of the aptness to sample your own phenomenal concept of what it's like to look at a work of art as pragmatic. So I think terms like, hey, or look out, or heads up, or do you smell that, or what's that? These sort of paradigmatically pragmatic expressions that are encouraging some sort of attendant action or shift of attention. Another one is deixis, where you're pointing at something in particular. Those features of language and communication seem best explained by pragmatic semantics. And so it seems like this effect that paintings have of getting you to think about what it's like to experience in them, calling your attention to your own experience of them, it seems also helpfully understood in this kind of pragmatic way, in my opinion. And it does seem fitting with the earlier accounts from these earlier formalists that I was talking about. This is language that got developed and concepts that got developed in the 1980s, but it does seem to fit, let's say, Roger Fry's view, where he writes, in all aesthetic experiences, there is a special orientation of the consciousness, and above all, a special focusing of the attention, since the act of aesthetic apprehension implies an attentive passivity to the effects or sensations apprehended in their relations. There should be a constant and recognizable pattern of the mental dispositions in such situations. It seems like philosophy is developed in a way where now we have more advanced tools to kind of vindicate what Fry was getting at in the 1920s. So now I'll just briefly gesture at two possible objections to my work. Wittgenstein's Blue Book, the same work where he was describing sampling and how sampling is kind of isomorphic with thought in many instances. He has a kind of nominalism in that work in which he rejects that abstract nominals like desire or experience correspond to any entity. And he thinks that these can be ultimately more misleading than clarifying. And so I'll give an example in terms of waiting from the Blue Book that I love. Wittgenstein writes, what happens if at 4 till 4:30, A expects B to come to his room? If in one sense in which the phrase to expect something from 4 to 4:30 is used, it certainly does not refer to one process or state of mind going on throughout the interval, but to a great many different activities and states of mind. If, for instance, I expect B to come to tea, what happens may be this: at 4 o'clock, I look at my diary and see the name B against today's date. I prepare tea for 2. I think for a moment, does B smoke? I put out cigarettes. Towards 4:30, I begin to feel impatient. I imagine B as he will look when he comes into my room. All this is called expecting B from 4 to 4:30. And there are endless variations to this process, which we all describe by the same expression. If one asks what the different processes of expecting someone to tea have in common, the answer is that there is no single feature in common to all of them, though there are many common features overlapping. These cases of expectation form a family. They have a family likeness, which are not clearly defined. And so, whereas I've been proposing some kind of single phenomenal concept for what it's like to experience an abstract work of art, Wittgenstein warns against reifying abstract nouns into substantial entities. And so, whereas we might think that there's just one concept that we have of what it's like to experience a painting, in fact, all the different times we go to see the painting, we might have different sorts of experiences that don't share any single features in common and might be different over time. And so condensing these or unifying them under some kind of single recognitional experiential concept might violate this kind of nominalist principle that, in fact, when we're describing experience, there's a variety of possibilities and that we can refer to them in language, but in fact, there's no kind of overall general single feature that the concept would track, something like that. And then the last objection I have, besides this kind of nominalist concern about forming some singular concept of the experience of an all-over painting, is Leo Steinberg and other criteria. He's really reacting to Greenberg's formalist proposal that a medium has one single success criterion. And so just as Greenberg is encouraging viewers of paintings to look at them in one single way by attending to the formal features first and then trying to form some kind of experience, some kind of at-onceness that engenders disinterested contemplation of those features, Steinberg proposes that there's many different ways in which paintings might be best viewed, and imposing some kind of single all-over approach could flatten out the value of lots of different works of art. And his main example in the essay is in terms of pop art, where Greenberg thinks all paintings are supposed to delimit flatness. Steinberg shows that just really isn't an effective model for many instances of pop art. And then he further shows that depictive content like this body in Olympia by Jean Dubuffet can actually create the formal properties of paintings that Greenberg thinks is so valuable and distinctive. So for Greenberg, again, what paintings really do is delimit flatness, and a successful painting does that. And Steinberg argues that by including depicted content in Olympia, Jean Dubuffet creates the effect of this flatness and uses painterly methods to create that effect more effectively than if he had no depicted content. So those are two kind of objections I've been thinking to of my view, and that's the entire talk. I think I've gone significantly over time for what we were expecting. So I really appreciate everyone for sticking through this, and I'll leave it to the moderators to decide how long we have for questions.
Muted. Excellent. Why don't we, yeah, normally we end after about an hour. So let's say 6:30, I think.
Thank you.
Of
and
course,
I
though,
apologize
if you'd like to
for...
keep it, yeah, if you'd like to keep it open longer, of course, welcome to do that. We just have to go.
6:30 should be fine.
We'll open it up to any questions. Okay, great. We'll open it up to any questions, and feel free to unmute yourselves, or you can drop questions in the chat and we will read them off.
I can jump in, as it were. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you. Yep.
Okay, cool. I wasn't hearing you, but now I hear you well. Well, so congratulations on what was to me an extremely stimulating paper. we've talked before about some of these issues, so we share, I think, a deep interest in these sort of next to the woods. But so I have I guess a general question, but before I get lost in how I want to get at that question, maybe I'll just say briefly, I think one way that I would allow you to just go at it, if what I say is not, and it just goes with the way you set up things, it is, what is the difference in what's at stake at your position or the state that you're at in between taking a turn into the pragmatics that you're talking about, broadly construed Austinian, and then going to Davidsonian semantics. I'm not sure why you want to go. I mean, it seems like you just. So the question is, it seemed to me, so I was hearing you, that it was just like I could go this way or that way, and it seems to me that with each way you go, there might be positions that you're taking and conceptual baggages that you're taking on each. And so here is, so that's the I think that's one way of allowing me to answer my question. If I try to now, I am about to move on quickly. If I try to express that concern that I've had all along the way in various turns that you took, and I guess the basic concern, you actually mentioned it, and it's hard to express, but I think you'll be able to sort of think what I'm thinking, is that maybe you're going over intellectualizing things a bit, over conceptualizing at various turns of the way. And I think you brought it exactly in terms of people that read Greenberg doing that with Kant, which I agree, if that helps in order for you and I to understand one another, right? And I mean, here's one go at it, okay? In the best way that I can do it, after having read your paper and like think about this. I said, okay, so let's think about, you said something like, okay, so aboutness is like a representation. It's a representation of a mode of creation, which immediately makes me think, know that differences in philosophy. Then I think, okay, so it's a mode of representation, and you sort of center on the intention of the artist. Okay. And then I think, okay, so here's the question. What are you representing yourself? What features are you representing yourself of that way of mode of doing something? Yeah. And what are you taking yourself to be doing when you do that? I'm thinking of an example I've discussed with David Hills before about Zen and the art of motorcycles, in regards with Kant as well. So this is I don't know if you read the book. If you guys have read the book, but it's a good book, anyways. And it's about what it's like to take care of a motorcycle. And wanting to learn to take care of your motorcycle. By being instructed by somebody in a way that it's a mode of doing it, and not just a set of abstract, bits and pieces of information. It's something you have to sort of do yourself a bit, and you kind of have to, put your hand inside underneath the thing to see how heated it is. And so then, are you sampling representations of what it is like to be doing what your instructor is teaching you, or are you just simply doing it yourself? So I guess, and with this I will end. And of course, this is a major topic in your paper, and it's a very interesting concept. What sampling is, and how intellectual or over intellectual your account of it sounds to me at times. But you're also very open to pragmatic accounts. So I guess that goes to my original question. And which way you want to go and how that sort of falls in your own interests and, particular values that you have in this debate.
Thank you, Pedro. That's all so helpful. Really appreciate it. So I guess my foundational insight that everything is built on top of is that these very abstract works are apt to produce sampling of phenomenal concepts. They're apt to produce an introspection and attention to what it feels like to experience and view them. That's kind of my starting point. And then I thought that aptness to produce this certain kind of mental attention, namely mental attention to the experiential features of viewing the painting. So first of all, that seems to me as a certain kind of aboutness, and these aptness or these dispositions might be better cashed out non-representationally, not in terms of aboutness. That's one possibility. And so I found this aptness to produce attention to certain kinds of features of mental experience, just kind of naturally fitting in well with pragmatic accounts, which try to capture the effects, the mental and behavioral kind of effects of language, and particularly the context that comes in with deixis. Let's say, if you say, look at that, or you're indicating or gesturing at something. And so it seems like because the experiential features of your viewing are being indicated or kind of pointed out by these paintings, a pragmatic framework seemed to kind of fit them best to bring them out. But with the Davidsonian stuff, basically I was trying to say, I'm not committed to the kind of foundational interests I have in the project are not to develop something like pragmatic representation in visual art, or give an account of what pragmatic aboutness is. It's trying to explain this aptness to produce certain attention to experiential features. And so it seemed to me that while pragmatics is particularly well situated to explain this, other sorts of semantic theorists have kind of other approaches to describing this these effects of language or something like that. And so that's my response to your the pragmatics part of your questioning. I love the point that you made about maybe one of our reactions to Greenberg is that he's over intellectualizing the experience of these all over paintings. And I sense that there's something wrong with that over intellectualization, but then instead of just completely dispensing with it, I just offer a substitute, a new kind of over intellectualization. So I think that's a great point, and I'm going to reflect on that more. And then my last response in terms of the art of motorcycle maintenance, it does seem to be that motorcycle maintenance is apt to produce certain sorts of attention and certain sorts of states of mind. It does seem that because motorcycles have these features that you have to, pay close attention to, and these mechanisms, how they work, there's more things to pay attention to. So therefore, even though there's something that it's like, you can have a phenomenal concept of motorcycle maintenance or a particular kind of motorcycle maintenance. Motorcycles are less apt to produce reflection about your phenomenal experience than these all-over paintings are, because the all-over paintings give you nothing else to really hook onto. There's no images, there's no tasks, you're just like the connoisseur stuck there in front of this field of color, and you're therefore trying to fix your mind on something. And so really what's left over is your own experience of the work. And so that's kind of what you end up conceptualizing. And so I can totally grant that you can have phenomenal concepts about motorcycles or something like that. And I guess it goes back to this kind of fundamental insight that I'm trying to work out, this aptness to produce sampling of phenomenal concepts, which seems a little less obvious in the motorcycle case. And I look forward to meeting up and maybe talking about this more with you in the future. Thanks a lot, Pedro.
Yeah, thank you. Especially I take your point with regards to motorcycle maintenance perhaps being slightly more generous with things you can conceptually hook on to, as opposed to abstract art. So in that, making it more apt, I understand that point. Yeah.
So when you experience an abstract work, you have a certain kind of experience, a particular experience. You don't necessarily use that as a sample. If you do use it, think of it as a sample, then as you pointed out, what samples do is pick out properties, usually not just a particular thing, but a property, a kind of thing. And that means some abstraction of the many different properties that your actual particular experience has. And I suppose that's a little bit of, when you do that, that's a little bit of intellectualization. That is, then you can say later on, maybe, I had an experience like that. And you might also say other people maybe or do have experiences like that, where their experiences won't be, you're not supposing that they have exactly the same experience, but that it's similar in some not easily describable way. And so maybe that's what's going on. That is, once not just having an experience, but you treat it as a sample of some more abstract property, which then you might be interested in. And of course, how you ever know that anybody else has an experience like that is, of course, a good question. But I think we may have some inclination to think that that's so. But also, about the pragmatic aspect, Austin's notion of illocutionary acts, of course, are acts performed by people, by speakers in speaking. And I think I recall you're quoting this person, Dixon, saying that pictures perform illocutionary acts. And of course, that's not Austin's view. Austin's view might be that in producing a certain picture, the painter performs an illocutionary act. And that raises the question of what if there is no painter or no recognition of a painter, or you have a natural object or something or other. There will presumably be no illocutionary action in the vicinity in Austin's sense. And you will have an experience when you experience it, and then you might use that as a sample, but that's different. And that, of course, raises all kinds of questions about how appreciation or understanding of painters and musicians and composers come into play. And that actually is very interesting. I don't think this was I don't think I realized this when we had our seminar some years ago, but Hanslick, in talking about music, sometimes seems to be thinking that the composer has no role at all in your experience of it. The composer produces sounds, and they have tonally, well, in one translation, they're tonally moving forms which you follow and so forth. But there's another place in Hanslick in which he says that in appreciating it, you follow along with what the composer did, and you have a sense of how brilliant the composer was and so forth, which sounds like you might be getting something a little bit more like an illocutionary action involved, which initially doesn't seem to have anything to do with what Hanslick was in the most famously quoted parts of Hanslick. It doesn't have anything to do with what in those parts he seems to be saying. Anyway, lots of interesting things to think about. That's all I have for now.
Thanks so much, Ken. A really brief response is I had a slide about apophatic experience and how sampling phenomenal concepts is particularly useful for these experiences that are hard to put into words. and as you said, not easily describable. And I think that really does characterize the experience of viewing lots of abstract works of art. It's not easily describable. It's a different kind of order of experience. And because there's so little kind of depicted content, we don't have a lot of vocabulary to kind of latch onto to describe, what's responsible for that experience or the different parts of it. And so I'm thinking of emphasizing this idea about maybe the apophatic or the not easily describable, what's kind of unique about very abstract artworks in terms of their experience not being easily describable, and maybe that accounting for why we are likely to have phenomenal concepts that we sample and communicate with about them. So I appreciate that. I really appreciate your points about Austin, and maybe I'll drop the illocutionary framework, or I'll dig deeper into Dixon to have a fuller response. But I think it's the gestural, the indication. I'm thinking that the paintings are kind of pointing us to the phenomenal concepts that we form about them. And that's really the most kind of pragmatic thing that they're doing. It's the indication, the pointing, that makes me want to characterize that as the illocutionary force of the paintings. But I'll think harder about this and maybe go back through Austin. And yeah.
Just make it clear whether you're talking about illocutionary acts as acts of a person or something having to do with just the work itself. I think that needs to be sorted out.
Excellent, thank you. So we're almost at 6:30. So definitely anyone can leave. Yeah, Laura.
Yeah, I think we have two more questions. So Gabriel, I don't know how you say your name, has had their hand up for a while, and then Romy. So maybe we'll do those two questions and then say goodbye, say good evening for the time being, and maybe you guys can keep having conversations as needed. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you all again for bearing through all this. And yeah, looking forward to it, Gabriel. Thanks.
Hey, Grant, thank you so much. I loved your presentation. I guess, normally I would consider myself a formalist, but I also have to admit that I'm someone who doesn't get abstract art. And I love the way that you were bringing those two things together. And you've definitely given me some new ways of appreciating works that previously I found pretty uninviting. I do have a question, which is, how does judgment fit into all of this? Because let's say that I grant your thesis that like abstract paintings have, some unique way of manifesting or invoking like a phenomenal concept that more representational art forms don't. Then within the realm of abstract paintings, if what the paintings are about is what it's like to view them, I guess I just worry that this, like on one hand, this really convincing idea is also an idea that's pretty much indifferent to the content of a specific painting, and so I guess I just wonder, like, what sort of room is there here for judgment or evaluation? Why might some phenomenal concepts be better to sample than others? Or is that, not really a concern for you, which I would also be, which I would also accept. But yeah, I'd love to hear your take on how judgment relates to all of this.
Great question. This is really helpful, and not a way I'd been thinking about it exactly. So it's really nice to get this perspective. So for a formalist, which I don't know if I even count myself as a formalist to the same extent that you do, what a medium uniquely performs, what's distinctive about a medium often provides success criteria for a work of art. If it is a good instance of these essential features of the medium, that's usually the criteria for judgment, whether the work of art is valuable or good or not. So I'm not sure if I'm as committed a formalist like Greenberg, but if you were to kind of if you were to go through and just kind of update Greenberg and keep the view, then you would hold that works of art are valuable because not just some kinds of sampling phenomenal concepts are better than others, but in general, sampling phenomenal concepts are something we don't do enough as a society, and it's good for us to do because that's Greenberg's view, that this disinterested contemplation that abstract art engenders is not common enough in our society, and it's a really kind of valuable form of mental activity. And so the paintings, therefore, are valuable. Contemporary analytic philosophers are a lot more neutral about the value of sampling phenomenal concepts compared to even Kant on the value of, aesthetic contemplation and that sort of thing. And so that maybe partly accounts for why the kind of move outside of Kantianism might lose some of the distinctive value of what these works of art are apt to produce. And then just one last thing, it seems like not all paintings will grab your attention in the same way. And so you might not pay as close attention to some as others. And so there's some abstract paintings that just might kind of leave you neutral, where you don't have a strong experience of the painting, and then you just kind of quickly move on from it. You're not really moved by it, and you don't have a rich experience of it. And in those paintings, then you'd have fewer experiential features you'd have fewer features of your own experience to conceptualize. And so it might be a necessary condition for these kinds of works that they at least grab your attention and kind of absorb you in a non-literary way. And so sampling phenomenal concepts might be predicated at least on some active attention to the work. And then that might help differentiate good from bad all over abstract paintings. The ones that catch your attention so that you stand in front of them, that's necessary for conceptualizing the features of your experience. And so the ones that succeed would be the attention grabbing ones or something like that. But I hadn't thought about that. So excellent question. That really helps.
Okay. I'm going to try to be really, really quick. Grant, this was wonderful. So we can talk about this further, right? Because I'm insufferable and I know so. So the first question, it's just, I wonder what you're missing or what you're losing by disregarding literary criticism and literary theory, because what you're referring to as literary is what art critics are saying that literary is. And they're saying that in the 1920s, if I'm not mistaken, but you have Russian formalism in the 1910s. And so I wonder whether you can even afford to not to mention that. Considering the fact that you talk about formalism in art criticism, and then you refer to new formalism, but the new formalism that you mentioned, meaning Levinson, that formalism is new with respect to an old formalism that is not Fry, but Russian formalism. So the definition of formalism in the sense that Russian formalists use it, it's just incredibly different from the one that the critics with whom you're working are defining the term. And it has really little to do with aboutness. So I think that's important for you to consider if you want to work with early 20th century theory of art. And also I would say that the other point, as someone who works with literary studies, is this idea of the aptness to produce sampling of phenomenal concepts, of this idea that paintings are pointing to X or Y. That seems to me to have been conceptualized as a fallacy twice in the history of literary criticism, as the fallacy of agency and as the effective fallacy, right? Because you're identifying the effect that the thing has on you with that which the thing is supposedly be doing. And so how is it that a work of art does X or Y? How is it that a work of art has agency? That's a problem to me. And the last thing that I would ask is, when you say that things are not easily describable, I would ask, like, for whom? Who's the we that's part of the group of people for whom it is difficult to explain how to describe a work of art? Because you give the example of Wittgenstein saying, like, we cannot really name this color, but actually scientists can, like cognitive scientists can map those colors. And so I'm wondering, like, I don't know, I agree with Pedro that maybe it's just too much theoretical baggage, and maybe you do want to keep it more minimalist, but I wonder whether people who have been highly criticized, like Davidson's theory of intention or Austin's theory of speech act, whether those are your best interlocutors to justify, or Nagel even on physicalist accounts criticized by Block. Like, why are you not mentioning these criticisms or yeah, I don't know.
Let's see. Yeah, I got my mic. Those are fantastic points, Romy, and I look forward to speaking to you more so you can keep holding my feet to the fire about any other details that you left out of your account. So that was just really, really helpful. So I'll kind of just quickly go through it. Literary absorption, I guess I'm treating that as a technical term, and I could be more careful about indicating that I'm not kind of endorsing Clive Bell and Roger Fry and these sorts of views of literary absorption in a painting, because that does seem pretty controversial and idiosyncratic, and also it leaves out the formal aspects of literature, and so I might try to not put that in my own voice, but really treat that as just a specific view of Fry and Bell, and I might need to update and revise that proposal in contemporary language if I want to, if I find it a useful kind of concept, literary absorption, as opposed to paying attention to the formal features of works. There's probably more updated vocabulary, like you're saying, to do that. So that's really helpful. With the Majory Levinson new formalists, I was basically just showing that new formalists have entrenched their position in a sort of Kantian fashion. And so it's new formalism. It's maybe, I don't know how many neo-Kantian, it's some kind of updated, she gives all these terms like autotelic, et cetera, that they're committed to. And so that was really the only kind of main feature I was trying to bring up by showing that strong Kantian commitments today can put you at odds with large groups of scholars like historicists, for example, as motivating why we'd want to lose that feature of Greenberg's account. But I was just focusing on a kind of small feature of these new formalists, but it is always helpful to have the greater perspective and to see how the new formalists are coming out of a tradition or opposing old formalism, which is rational formalism, which is different than the kind of Greenbergian account that I'm doing. So I could give a kind of richer, more nuanced presentation of these new formalists, or just lose that point in general and come up with another reason why it's worthwhile to get rid of the Kantian framework of Greenberg's theory. And then thank you for pointing me to the fallacy of agency and the affective fallacy. I'll similar to kind of Ken's worries about illocutionary acts that the painting is performing, I might just have to bite the bullet on the fallacy of agency and look at this kind of new research from Dixon's dissertation, et cetera, and kind of argue that paintings do produce effects in some kind of quasi-agential way. Clearly, I don't think that they have full-fledged human type mental states or anything like that, but they might be able to produce, and so that gets close to agency. And then I'll look more into the affective fallacy. I'm familiar with this from philosophy, the vitus dormitiva that you hear in Moliere when you're trying to say, oh, what makes this pill put us to sleep? Oh, it has a dormitive power, something like that. And so I'm not sure how much that connects to the 20th century theory of the affective fallacy and art and literary criticism, but I'll look into it, and I really appreciate those, and look forward to anything else you have to say in the future about the project.
Excellent.
Fantastic.
All right. Great. All right. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Grant. And we will wrap up here. And that is it. So we'll be sending out the schedule for the winter in the coming weeks, and hope everyone has a lovely evening.
Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.